When I first decided to visit the Grand Canyon, it wasn't for adventure or thrills. I had been going through a rough patch, the kind that chips away at your sense of self and leaves you wondering what's left. My name is Caleb Watson, and back then, I was just another guy trying to find some peace. My best friend Drew and I planned the trip on a whim, deciding that a few days of camping away from the noise of life might help us reset. We arrived at the South Rim in the late afternoon. The sky was painted with streaks of amber and violet as the sun sank low on the horizon. The sheer scale of the canyon silenced every thought in my head. The endless expanse of jagged cliffs and winding ridges seemed almost alive, a breathing relic of time that dwarfed our presence. We pitched our tent at one of the more remote sites, a spot Drew had picked for its supposed serenity. No crowds, he'd said, just us and nature. It was quiet, all right. Too quiet. The first night passed uneventfully. The air carried the faint scent of juniper and earth, and the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the hoot of an owl punctuated the stillness. Drew and I shared a few beers by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, until exhaustion claimed us. The second night was when things began to feel off. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was Drew playing a prank. We'd been sitting around the fire again, the flames casting long shadows that danced against the jagged rocks surrounding our site. I'd stepped away to grab something from the tent when I heard it faint and almost melodic, like a breeze weaving through the canyon. Caleb. The sound stopped me in my tracks. I spun around, half expecting Drew to be standing there with a smirk on his face. But he was still by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick. "You say something?" I called out. Drew looked up, confused. "No." "Why?" I forced a laugh, brushing it off as my imagination. "Nothing. Thought I heard something, that's all." He shrugged and went back to tending the fire. But the unease in my chest lingered. Later that night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. They were slow, deliberate, crunching on the dry soil just beyond the thin fabric barrier. My heart leapt into my throat. "Drew," I whispered. He groaned beside me, clearly still half asleep. "What? Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Before I could respond, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on me like a weight. I grabbed the flashlight from my pack and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rocks and scattered brush. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I lingered there for a moment, scanning the shadows, before retreating back into the tent. Drew was already snoring again, oblivious. I told myself it was probably just an animal, and tried to go back to sleep. But every rustle of the wind outside set my nerves on edge. The next morning, I told Drew what had happened. "Probably a coyote or something," he said between bites of a granola bar. "They are all over the place out here." "Coyotes don't whisper," I muttered. He laughed, but it didn't feel genuine. I could tell he was trying to brush it off, just as I had the night before. We spent the day hiking along one of the less traveled trails, hoping the exercise and sunlight would shake the unease. The views were stunning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every so often, I'd catch Drew glancing over his shoulder too, his face tight with unease. Neither of us said anything about it, but the tension between us grew heavier as the day wore on. That night, the whispers came back. They started just as we were settling into our sleeping bags, faint and indistinct at first, like the murmurs of a distant conversation carried on the wind. "Do you hear that?" I asked Drew. He nodded, his face pale in the dim light of the lantern. We sat in silence, straining to make out the words. The voices seemed to come from all around us, bouncing off the canyon walls in an eerie echo. "Caleb." The sound of my name made my blood run cold. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Drew's eyes were wide with fear. It said my name too. We bolted out of the tent, flashlights in hand, and scanned the area. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak, flickering light over the campsite. Beyond its glow, the darkness was impenetrable. "Who's out there?" Drew shouted, his voice cracking. No response. We stayed up the rest of the night, backs pressed against the rocks with our flashlights trained on the shadows. The whispers faded as the hours dragged on, but neither of us dared to close our eyes. By morning, we were both on edge. Drew suggested packing up and heading back to the main campground, but I wasn't ready to leave just yet. Something about the whispers felt personal, like they were meant for us. I wanted answers, though I wasn't sure I would like what I found. We decided to stay one more night. The final night was worse than I could have imagined. The whispers started earlier this time, as we sat by the fire. They were louder now, clearer. Leave. The single word cut through the air like a blade. Drew and I froze, staring at each other with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" I asked. He nodded, his face pale. We didn't wait to see what would happen next. Scrambling to pack up our gear, we were both shaking with adrenaline. But the whispers didn't stop. "Caleb! Drew!" The voices were everywhere, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of fear. They grew louder and louder until it felt like they were screaming inside my head. "Go." The command was deafening. We grabbed what we could and ran, leaving the tent and most of our supplies behind. The trail back to the main campground felt endless, the darkness around us alive with movement and sound. I swear I could feel something following us. Its presence heavy and oppressive. Drew kept looking over his shoulder, his face a mask of terror. When we finally reached the safety of the main campground, the whispers stopped. We reported what had happened to a park ranger the next morning. He listened patiently, his expression unreadable. "You're not the first to experience something like that," he said quietly. "The canyon has a way of playing tricks on people." I wanted to press him for more information, but the look in his eyes stopped me. Whatever he knew, it wasn't something he was willing to share. I haven't been back to the Grand Canyon since that trip. Sometimes I wonder if it was all in our heads, a shared hallucination brought on by stress and isolation. But deep down, I know the truth. The whispers were real. And they weren't just voices. They were something else. Something ancient. Something that didn't want us there. It was the kind of heat that clung to you like a second skin, even as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks of the Chisos Mountains. Big Bend National Park in July isn't for the faint of heart. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mesquite and desert blooms, and the cicadas cried out like restless spirits. My name is Daniel Hart, and I've been a ranger here for the better part of 2 decades. I've seen my fair share of strange things in the vast, desolate stretches of this park. Everything from lost hikers to unexplained lights in the sky. But nothing comes close to the events of that night. It started innocently enough. July 15th, 2018. The park was quieter than usual, most visitors deterred by the relentless summer heat. I was on the late shift, patrolling the Rio Grande Village area when I spotted their RV, a sleek white vehicle parked neatly at one of the designated camping spots. The fire pit nearby was lit, flames dancing lazily against the twilight. From a distance, I saw the couple sitting close together, silhouetted by the firelight. They looked peaceful, laughing softly as they shared a meal. I didn't think much of it. Campers were common, and this pair didn't seem any different, just another couple escaping the chaos of city life for the serenity of the desert. The next morning, I returned to the spot during my rounds. The fire was still burning, reduced to embers, but still alive. That struck me as odd. It's park protocol to fully extinguish campfires before turning in, and most visitors are pretty diligent about it. The RV was there, parked in the same spot. But something about it felt wrong. The air around it was still, unnaturally so, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I called out, my voice breaking the silence. "Hello? Park ranger here. Just checking in." No answer. I stepped closer, the gravel crunching beneath my boots. The windows of the RV were tinted, giving me no clue as to what was inside. The door was locked, which wasn't unusual. But when I tried the handle, I noticed something strange. The lock was engaged from the inside. That's when I noticed the chairs around the fire pit. 2 of them, perfectly placed, with blankets draped over the backs. Plates of half-eaten food sat on the small camping table, as if the couple had simply stepped away for a moment. But the food was untouched, now buzzing with flies. The air felt heavier, colder. despite the sun climbing higher in the sky. I radioed back to the main station, reporting the situation. By noon, a search team had assembled. We started combing the area, calling out their names, Rachel and Mark Lanning, according to the park registry. Their RV was towed back to the station for further inspection. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Their clothes were neatly folded in the drawers. A pair of hiking boots sat by the door. The only thing missing was them. The strangest part? Their personal items, wallets, phones, keys were all still inside. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. The search extended for miles around the campsite, but the desert gave us nothing. No footprints, no discarded belongings. Just the endless expanse of rock and sand, indifferent to our desperation. 3 days into the search, one of the rangers found something. Deep in a ravine, miles from the campsite, he came across a circle of scorched earth. In the center was a pile of ash, surrounded by strange symbols carved into the ground. They looked ancient, almost ritualistic. None of us could make sense of it. That night, back at the station, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind, their laughter by the fire, the untouched food, the eerie stillness of the RV. Around midnight, I decided to review the footage from the trail cameras we'd set up near the campsite. At first, there was nothing unusual. The couple arrived at the campsite around 6 p.m., laughing and unloading their gear. They set up their chairs, lit the fire, and sat down to eat. But then, around 10:30 p.m., the footage became strange. The screen flickered, static distorting the image. For a split second, I thought I saw something. Something tall and shadowy moving just beyond the firelight. It was there, and then it wasn't. The next few frames showed the couple looking around nervously, as if they'd heard something. Then, the screen went black. When the footage resumed, the fire was burning alone. The chairs were empty. Word spread quickly among the rangers, though we were careful not to alarm the public. But fear has a way of creeping in, silent and insidious. Every night, I found myself drawn back to the campsite, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching us. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't an animal I've lived in this park long enough to recognize every howl, growl, and screech the desert has to offer. This was something else. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The light landed on something in the distance, two faint shapes standing side by side. My heart stopped. Rachel? Mark? No response. I took a step closer, my hand instinctively reaching for the radio on my belt. And then, they were gone. The official investigation lasted 2 weeks before it was quietly closed. The report listed their disappearance as unknown causes, a vague term that offered no comfort. But I couldn't let it go. I started digging, poring over old records and local legends. That's when I came across the story tales of an ancient curse tied to the land. They spoke of a shadowy figure that roamed the desert, luring unsuspecting travelers into the night. Those who followed never returned. I don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I want to. But every now and then, as I patrol the park, I hear that low, guttural sound echoing through the canyons. And I wonder if Rachel and Mark are still out there, trapped in the endless expanse of Big Bend, forever lost to the desert's embrace. If you ever visit, be careful. And whatever you do, don't follow the shadows. The memory of that night still grips me like a vice, its cold fingers curling around my throat whenever I try to push it away. It was March of 2021, a month I thought would be the beginning of something new, a break from the suffocating routine of pandemic isolation. Zion National Park seemed like the perfect escape. I had rented an RV for a week of solitude, a chance to breathe in the wilderness and lose myself in the grandeur of nature. But what I found was far from peace. I arrived in the late afternoon, the towering sandstone cliffs casting long shadows over the campground. It was early in the season, and the park was almost eerily quiet. Only a handful of other RVs dotted the designated lot, each spaced generously apart to preserve the illusion of isolation. By sunset, Those few neighbors had packed up and left, leaving me completely alone. Or so I thought. The wind had started to pick up by the time I settled in for the night. My RV rocked gently, a comforting reminder of the stormy nights of my childhood when I would fall asleep to the sound of rain pelting the roof. I brewed a cup of tea, pulled out a novel I'd been meaning to finish, and let the world outside blur into the background. It was around 10 p.m. when I first noticed it, the faint glow in the distance. At first, I thought it was the moon breaking through the clouds. But when I peered through the RV window, I saw a small, flickering light swaying in the darkness. A lantern. It hung suspended from what seemed to be an invisible hand, moving as though someone was carrying it, but I couldn't make out a figure. I told myself it was a trick of the light. Perhaps another camper who'd arrived late and was setting up their site. Still, a knot of unease coiled in my stomach. The campground had been deserted when I arrived, and the ranger at the gate had mentioned that the area was mostly empty this time of year. I watched the lantern for a while, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. The light bobbed and weaved as if it were being carried closer. But there was no sound, no crunch of footsteps on the gravel, no rustling of bushes. Just the wind, whistling low and mournful through the canyon. By the time the light reached the edge of my campsite, my curiosity had turned to dread. I told myself to stay put, to lock the RV door and wait for morning. But some irrational part of me mixture of fear and fascination compelled me to step outside. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and biting against my skin. I stood there, squinting into the dark, as the lantern came to a sudden stop about 20 feet away. It swayed gently, as though whoever or whatever held it was waiting for me to make the next move. "Hello?" My voice sounded small, swallowed up by the vast emptiness around me. "Is someone there?" No answer. I took a cautious step forward, my boots crunching on the gravel. The lantern didn't move. I could feel my pulse hammering in my ears as I reached the edge of the light's glow. And that's when I saw it, an old, rusted lantern, hanging from a frayed piece of rope, tied to a skeletal tree branch. There was no one holding it. The flame inside flickered unnaturally, its light casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and shift with a life of their own. I felt an almost magnetic pull toward it, an irrational urge to reach out and touch the glass. But as I raised my hand, the flame sputtered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The wind howled louder now, whipping through the trees like a chorus of wailing voices. I turned and ran back to the RV, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled with my phone, trying to call the ranger station, but there was no signal. That's when I heard it, a soft tapping, barely audible over the wind. It came from the side of the RV, a rhythmic, deliberate sound like fingers drumming on metal. I froze, my heart racing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, moving along the length of the vehicle as though something, or someone, was circling it. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The tapping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, straining to hear over the roar of the wind. And then, slowly, the tapping started again, this time from the roof. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting to the small skylight above the kitchenette. Through the frosted glass, I could see a faint shadow moving, its shape indistinct, but undeniably human. Panic surged through me. I grabbed the largest knife I could find from the kitchen drawer and crouched in the corner, my back against the cabinets. The shadow lingered for what felt like an eternity before it finally disappeared. I stayed there all night, too afraid to move, my eyes fixed on the door. The wind eventually died down, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I drove straight out of Zion, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I found a diner and sat trembling over a cup of coffee, trying to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. But deep down, I knew better. Even now, 2 years later, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Sometimes late at night, I will catch a glimpse of a flickering light out of the corner of my eye, and I'll hear that soft tapping in my dreams. And every time, I wake up with the same question echoing in my mind. Not yet, but when?